Welcome to this webinar on building a winning marketing strategy with attribution modeling. My name is Parag and I am a product marketing manager at Hevo. I'll be your host and moderator for this session. Let me introduce you to our today's speaker, Andy Caron. She's a VP of consulting at Revenue Pulse. Welcome, Andy, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
All right. So before we start, just an important note for everyone. So all the attendees will be on listen only mode. We are going to record this session, and post this session, we'll be sharing with you the recording as well as the presentation. And if you have any questions during this session, you can type them in the Q&A window available on your screen, and we will address them one by one at the end of this session. All right, so before we start, here is the agenda of today's session. So we'll start with the introduction first. I'll introduce you to Hevo, and we'll also do a quick introduction about our speaker. Then I'll hand over control to Andy, who will then deep dive into our today's topic. And then in the end, we will do a round of Q&A, and we'll address all your questions one by one. All right. So let me give you a quick introduction to Hevo. So as we all deal with data silos, and integrating data silos is a tedious and time consuming task. It involves a lot of manual processes, as we all know. And that's where Hevo comes into picture. So Hevo is a no-code data pipeline platform that helps you integrate your data spread across multiple sources, be it databases, SaaS applications, so on and so forth, all into a data warehouse, which can be, Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, or many more that are available in the market. Now, this platform supports 100 plus pre-built integrations with different types of data sources. As I mentioned, a lot of databases, data warehouses, SaaS applications, SDK, and streaming services, and many more. So you can easily connect your data sources and unify your data in just a few minutes. So Hevo is currently used by thousands of data professionals and marketing analysts globally. So which are from all the data driven companies which are spread across 26 different countries today. Now we have recently introduced a new offering which is Hevo Activate. So Hevo Activate lets you connect all your warehouse data to any of your marketing, sales, or business applications. With this tool, you'll be able to gather all your customer data in one tool and find actionable insights on the go. So currently we have built a ready to use integration with Salesforce, which is obviously a number one CRM platform. Which can help you easily move all your marketing, sales, support, or success data from different tools or systems to Salesforce, and for better analysis or better analyzing your entire customer journey. If you want to know more about this product, or you want to try, sign up, subscribe for a free trial, then you can check our website www.hevodata.com, and you can register for a free trial there. All right. So with this introduction about the product, let me give you a quick introduction about our today's speaker, Andy Caron. She is a marketing technologist with over 10 years of experience in B2B startups and global enterprises. Marketo is her happy place. She is a 2 times Marketo champion and a proud member of the Marketo Fearless 50 program. She's passionate about MarTech ecosystem, attribution, coaching future marketers. Currently, Andy is working as a VP of consulting at Revenue Pulse. Revenue Pulse is a boutique Marketo consulting based in Canada. And she's a consultant by day and leader of the Chicago Marketo user group by night. So with this introduction, I'll now request Andy to take over the control and start with the presentation. Andy, over.
All right. Yeah. Can you pass sharing?
Screen.
All right. Beautiful. All right, so let's get started. Excited to walk you guys through today, building a winning marketing strategy with attribution modeling. So we're going to cover sort of a basics to more robust approach to attribution, just to set a good baseline today. So as mentioned, I'm Andy Caron. There are a variety of ways to get a hold of me. So if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, send me a quick email if you have additional questions following our presentation today. Always happy to connect with people across the variety of social networks and ecosystems that we have today. So let's go ahead and dig in here. So today we're going to walk through 4 different components around attribution modeling. We're going to start with understanding attribution, look at how to evolve your idea around ROI and ROI calculation. We're going to look at building models because the reality is that you're going to need more than one. And then finally, we're going to talk about analyzing and optimizing with attribution and ROI specifically. All right, so let's start with understanding attribution. Essentially, attribution is the science or methodology of determining which campaign or campaigns ultimately drive to revenue. So what dollars do we spend as marketers that turn into dollars for the business? So very basic level, ROI, return on investment. This is our closed won deals, so CRM opportunities, the actual engagements, the programs, the campaigns that we're talking about, Marketo terms and Salesforce terms that relate to that. And then finally, the investment. So this is going to be across our ad platforms and any offline spend locations that we have as well. The calculation on this essentially looks like this. Return divided by investment is going to give you ROI. So if you have $1 million and you invested 100,000 to get that, that's a 10 to 1 ROI, which is the baseline. Now, most brands, I think in general, are able to get to some sort of analogous, maybe not perfect ROI calculation based on their total spend and understanding at some level what portion of their revenue total is impacted by marketing. It's not a perfect calculation. It's not necessarily decision driving, but it does give you a good baseline for that number moving up or down and having a target. Now, the ROI numbers that we're looking at today are very high. Most brands don't have a 64 to 1. Most brands don't have a 5 to 1 on their ROI. But we're playing with numbers here, making it a little aspirational, so something to target for. So some of you may have a baseline of this type of approach, and where you're looking to try to get is going to be more in the weeds, where you're actually able to see the specific channels and sub-channels where you have spend. So that's the direction we're going to go today. So let's start talking about attribution. There are generally 2 distinct types of models. You've got single touch and multi-touch. Single touch is going to look at just one single inflection point along the journey to customer, whether that is first touch, whether that is lead conversion, whether that is the last touch before opportunity. It's just one single moment in the entire journey, and we're going to associate 100% of the revenue against that single touch. Multi-touch could be 2 touches, 10 touches, 20 touches, 200 touches. It's going to take into account whatever component of the model we're looking at, whether it's the early part of the journey, the mid part of the journey, the whole journey, and it's going to divide up either equally or with different percentages the various touches that occurred during that span of the journey and associate revenue against them. Some of the most common baseline attribution models are from a single touch perspective, first touch, lead creation, and last touch, although last touch is going much more out of favor. Some vendors no longer even provide it. And then some of the common multi-touch models include U-shaped and W-shaped. So U-shaped is from first touch to lead creation and anything that occurs in between. W-shaped, which is going to take into account first touch, lead creation, and last touch, which typically is synonymous with opportunity creation and the interactions that occur in between. And then a custom, full path, or AI model is going to look at everything up to actually closed won, so even past the creation of the opportunity on that path. Now, one of the things that I get asked most frequently as a consultant who works both in Marketo and heavily in attribution tools, so the lean data, visibles, et cetera, of the world, is which attribution model should we use? And the question is inherently flawed because it assumes that you only need one model. And if you only needed one model to answer all of the questions and surface the data that you need for the KPIs that you're reporting against, there would only be one model. The reason that there are so many different models is that each one answers an inherently different part of the questions that marketers are needing to report on. So if we're talking about what's sparking initial interest, that's first touch. We're talking about what's actually driving new names into your database, getting people to fill out a form for the first time, that's lead creation. We're looking at that journey from first touch to lead creation, that overall brand awareness, that would be U-shaped, and so on and so forth. So each of the models that we're looking at today and in general are going to provide different insights into different areas where we spend our money. So just to level set so that we have a few common terms here, let's just get the sort of definitions around what we're going to be talking about today really nailed down. First touch, this is the first time we can visibly see an interaction. So typically this is a hit on the website or back when in-person events, maybe a visit to the booth, those types of things. Last touch, this is right prior to either opportunity creation or revenue, depending on the model that you're using and how your business works. Sometimes you don't have opportunities, there's just purchase. Lead creation, this is typically when someone gives you their email address for the very first time, or if you purchased it, then that would also be considered lead creation. Attribution modeling, these are the models, the percentages, and the calculations that we use to assign revenue to either different interactions as they occur over the timeline or different types of interactions if we're weighting those based on channel, source, or tactic. So UTM, most of you are probably familiar with at this point. This is the capability to provide additional information on inbound leads as they come to the site from areas typically where there is spend. And then channel and sub-channel, we're going to be thinking about this in terms of source and medium. So if something is paid social, and then sub-channel would be LinkedIn. Organic, sub-channel is Google. And then finally, tactic or campaign, this would be more focused around where the channel and sub-channel are driving. So did it drive someone to a webinar? Did it drive them to download a white paper? Those types of things. Some systems tie or sort of cross tactic and channel together, and others display them very distinctly. It also depends on how your brand's approaching them. So let's look at the evolution of ROI, kind of the worldview of how we want to be thinking about ROI and how many people are today and what that journey looks like. So the actual evolution for most brands typically starts with very basic reporting, ad hoc single campaign analyses, and starting to understand how we want to be thinking about data from an organizational perspective. From there, we move from describing the impact of marketing to actually defining the impact of marketing. And I think this is an important leap that brands have to make to be able to go from saying webinars are helping the brand to saying webinars are actually helping the brand at this point in the journey in this way. So from general analysis, you are typically able to then move into forecasting and prediction. And at that point, that's when you start to be able to move into optimization and determining impact. So giving yourself levers you can pull to say, if I shift this particular budget up or down or reallocate or stop using this channel or sub-channel altogether, I anticipate that the shift will also down funnel have an impact of X or Y or Z. So most people typically start out talking about cost instead of return. And I find that a lot of brands are very focused initially, especially as they're getting kind of their feet under them on this around how much a lead costs. And this concept or notion of the cost per lead or CPL being the key decision-making data point on whether or not you continue to invest in a channel is very prolific at this point and can actually be damaging to the brand. And we're going to explore why. So if someone was making a CPL-based decision off of this one webinar, they might say, we got the most leads from organic and they were the cheapest, but we're doing all we can do in organic. And you'll notice that I do not have organic as costing $0 because there is in fact an inherent cost to maintaining and setting up correct SEO on your website. So I always factor that in. I don't want to have a zero on anything. And then, you know, our second cheapest lead is coming from Outbrain. We got 35 from there. But our largest producers are Google Ads and Google Display. So let's, you know, up our spend there because, you know, $130 for a lead's not bad. But when we're looking at this, someone who's making a data-driven decision based solely on spend is also probably going to back off the amount of spend that they have, for example, on LinkedIn, right? We don't want to be spending $300 per lead. Let's back that off. The spend on Twitter isn't bad, so let's up that, right? So they're making decisions based on how much things cost, not on the output of that spend. And that's the direction that we want and need to move, and that's where ROI is going to come in. So if we shift our perspective and we think about this from a down funnel analysis, from cost per lead to actually thinking about cost per deal instead. So yes, we had 88 leads that came through Google Ads, but only 13 of them turned in to actual one business. Similarly, on the organic output, only 12. But now when we look at this, you know, the numbers are starting to shift. The cost per deal amounts are starting to change the perspective just a little bit. The challenge with this for a lot of brands is that they feel like they don't have time to wait. But the reality is you probably have a lot of data already that you can go back and mine to start understanding as you're future planning what's happened in the past and what does that data tell you. So if your sales cycle is 6, 12 months long, the data that you have historically typically is a good baseline place to start to guide some of these conversations and ultimately decisions as you're rolling out new campaigns. As we then shift this down one more stage, we can talk about, here's the cost per deal, but if the average deal size for this example is 50K, what does that mean on who's going to win for the most revenue produced? And suddenly we're starting to look more closely at Google Ads. That's appearing as one of the better plays here, right? When we pull that down further though, and we look at actual revenue, this is where the conversation really starts to shift for businesses. Suddenly we discover that that LinkedIn decision that we might have made based on CPL would have been a really bad one for the business in this case, because the deal sizes for the leads that come in through this channel are significantly higher And in fact, this is actually probably a place that we want to think about increasing spend. So allowing that conversation to happen over time and to continue analyzing campaigns, not just the week after they rolled live or the month after they rolled live, but in a long tail discussion and really understanding that data over the time that it takes for the journey of the customer to happen to get the customer is an important part of this component. Any brand that's basing their marketing success solely on the number of MQLs that they got for a period of time ultimately is doing a disservice to the brand, because that's not about quality, it's about quantity. And we always want to be thinking about quality. All right, so if your desired output is to be able to get down several layers here, so we're thinking about channel and breaking out how much spend we have there versus the marketing touch revenue. Sub-channel, how much spend we have there versus the marketing touch revenue, because ultimately these are the components that are going to be making those decisions or allow us to make those decisions for us. We need to have the capability to actually track those. So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about next. We also want to be thinking about things from a perspective of tactic and then pivoting those two against each other. So you may find that some sub-channels perform very well on certain tactics and not on others. So those are components that when you get into the granularity, you do need to be mindful of as you're making decisions. It may ultimately turn out that LinkedIn performs well across all tactics, but you want to prove that out, right? So in order to connect spend and lead activity and the data around your touch points, you're going to probably need to be looking at one of two options as it relates to marketing attribution. Either something that is SFDC campaign based, because that's where most of the attribution platforms plug in is in Salesforce. A few of them play in Dynamics, but most of them are really CRM focused. And then leveraging UTM enrichment. For this, you are going to have a very solid process for data extraction and then pulling that into a BI tool. The process here is not going to function without each of those pieces of revenue tech. And or you're going to need to think about an attribution partner. The amount of data that we're generating and the capability to see a lot of these interactions simply at scale is not feasible in most homegrown solutions. It's the reality of the environment in which we're working today. Even with an attribution partner, I typically find that you still need to have a way to get the data out and then pivot and put that in a perspective related specifically to your business KPIs in the BI tool as well. So business insights tool. So that would be your Tableau, your Domos, those types of things. So the attribution landscape it can be a little daunting initially when you first take a look at it. The MarTech map keeps growing. It's bigger. They've just released a new one, I think, which, you know, I'm sure this area is even larger at this point. And when you look at platforms like G2 that help you to understand what's out there and what is pivoted, you know, within this subsection of MarTech, there are a few leaders that emerge overall, but there are so many different attribution partners that you can use. The benefit of using an attribution partner is that it helps to automate the actual creation of the touch points and to surface and pivot those against your opportunities, which is really the key part. You're going to need some sort of cookie or tracking code on your website in order to understand what people are doing there. You'll need a UTM strategy in place and potentially to be pulling that across onto the actual campaign member objects so you have that channel sub-channel comparison against tactic. And then once all of those touch points are cataloged, you'll need to then be able to surface them out to look at those from a at-scale perspective. So that's where the BI tool would come into play. So the output of building this type of revenue reporting looks a little something like this. The ability to look at a campaign level and then break that out by medium to understand how many total dollars you can attribute to each component of this, how many ops you've influenced, and the average opportunity size. So this is ultimately that data that's going to help you start to understand what levers you have to pull and decide which ones you actually want to adjust. The roll up on this means that you can look at this not just from a campaign perspective, but also, let's say, from a tactic perspective or from a total brand medium source perspective, and then ultimately just a total brand perspective. So you'll notice that not all influencers are created equal here, right? The average opportunity size is different. The total attribution, total number of people driven to opportunity through each of these interactions is going to be different. And so this is where attribution really is ultimately going to come into play. So let's talk about building your models and what that looks like. The first thing you need to do before you can baseline build any sort of attribution model is you need to have a clear methodology for data collection, and you need to be collecting that data in a accessible repository for usage. If you don't have data, you're not going to be able to have anything to build your models on top of. So this is really important. Some people will use an attribution partner, which they have on their website, and then pull the data through. Some people will leverage their campaign information in Salesforce and then synthesize that over. It just depends on what model you're using. So when you are selecting the models that you're going to implement for your brand, whether you're using out-of-the-box models like a first touch, a lead creation, which you likely will use for some of your KPIs, and then you're also looking at potentially building a custom model or custom models. It's really important to focus and start with your KPIs first. So those key performance indicators are going to guide you on what models and or focuses for your models are really going to be most important and definitive or defining for your brand. All right, so let's talk about touch-weighted models. This essentially means that we are weighting a different portion of the model or the journey based on where the interaction happened. So the source model looks at the first half of the journey before opportunity is created. So there's opportunity creation, that's our definitive line. An influenced model is going to look at the journey overall. So from start to finish, opportunity creation is in there in the middle. And then an accelerated model is going to look at the very end of that journey. So post-opportunity creation, what marketing influences got them over the finish line, helped accelerate them to revenue. All right, so as we think about these, we're going to think about these moving from a channel to a channel weighted model. So how do we think about weighting as it relates not to where it happens in their journey, but the type of channels or sub-channels that they're interacting with? So when we get to a point where we have baseline ROI data on how the channels are performing based on the touch points and the output of that revenue, that's where we can start to build custom models. So this kind of requires two layers of data. You have to have the baseline data, and then you need to have calculated baseline ROI. At this point, you'll bucket the ROI into weights from 1, well, technically 0, because some of these might not be really good performers, from 0 to 5. In this case, all of these are 1 or above. So anything that in this case is in that first bucket, we're using 1 to 10 on the ROI, we're giving a 1, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 5 for our top performers. So if the journey for this particular individual, and we'll just use the influenced journey, so the whole journey here, included an organic visit, then display, then a Google Ads visit, then organic, and then LinkedIn. The way that we would think about this is the total number of touches, and then we're going to multiply that or add that up with the weighted points. So in this case, we have 5 touches, and several of them are 5x, one of them is a 2x, and one of them is a 3x. We're going to take that total percentage, divide by the total number of weighted points, and that's going to give us our percentage per touch point that we then multiply out with the touch weight, and that gives our attribution percentage. So this can be a little confusing, but ultimately the way that this looks when we're done is if we've got 5 total touches, a weight of 20 points, we're dividing that 100% by 20, so that's 5%. And then 5 for the 5x touch point, 5 weighted touch point is 25%, and then so on and so forth. So if we saw from that journey an output of $200,000 in revenue, and we divide that by our associated percentages based on our weighted touch points, this is going to tell us how much money was generated across the business from this particular opportunity, closed won business, based on those percentages. When you roll this up at scale across all opportunities, this is where you start to understand what touch points should get the most weight, right? Or what touch points are getting the most credit. Now, this is a little biased, and I think that using a timeline model can be more accurate for a business, because as your ROI shifts, you will need to shift the weight on this a little bit. And so it's always going to show your top performers as being most important, but that's also accurate, right? So if we know that they have a higher ROI, they should also be getting a higher percentage of the revenue. That's essentially what this model is saying. Likewise, we can build a tactic weighted model. And this is really getting in the weeds on data science. This is not something a single team of one is probably going to be building, right? So in this case, we are building out a 0 to 5 model because our purchase list here you'll see actually has a negative ROI. So the 0.03 to 1 means that for every dollar we spend, we're not even getting $1 back. We're not even getting 50 cents back on that dollar spent. And so this is showing us that that's actually not even something we want to give any credit, right? This is costing us money. And so that the attribution model should reflect that. So in this case, the journey to customer was blog, web form, webinar, case study, blog, webinar. And so we're going to break this out similarly. 7 touches, total of 24 weighted points. And then we're going to do the math out the same way. So here's the percentages that each get. So we're going to associate those percentages across the touch point journey. And then when we roll that up, it's going to show us the dollar amounts associated specifically for this journey against the total final revenue. So these are models that you would be building inside of your BI tool and then pulling your data in and having that run over the top of the data. You can also do a blended weighted model if you really want to get advanced with this. So what this would do is this would say we're using channel here, right? We've got our channel, and then we're going to do a source model. So in this case, what we're going to do is say, here's when the opportunity is created. So the only components that are going to get revenue credit are those interactions that happened prior. So the LinkedIn organic and Google ad interactions will be counted in this model, but the display and organic would not. So what that looks like is a shift in percentage to a larger share of the percentage of, we'll say credit, although really attribution shouldn't ever be about marketing taking credit for their work. It is proving out the success of the work that you're doing, but it's ultimately a win for the business. It's not about what sales did or what marketing did. It's about the revenue generated from working together. So if we're looking here, we're not going to give any a percentage of revenue to the later touches that happened later in the interaction and the engagement. We're solely looking at the beginning part of the journey. So that's how you would blend a sourced model with a weighted model. All right, so let's talk about analyzing and optimizing this. So the first thing we have to do is create hypotheses. So in this, we're saying if we increase LinkedIn spend by 50%, we'll maintain an ROI at or above 120 to 1. Right now, that's showing 131 to 1, which is an incredible ROI for any channel, obviously. But again, we're dreaming big, right? So that's our hypothesis. And then we're going to create a second hypothesis to test at the same time based on tactics that if we take the purchase list budget, which is pretty sizable, at 70K, and reallocate that to webinars, that we can target an ROI that's about 30 to 1 when we've been seeing one that's 37 to 1. And the key here is to know that yes, your ROI may shift slightly. It might even drop a little bit. But if you're reallocating dollars that don't have a positive ROI or have a very low ROI elsewhere, you're still making more money at the end of the day with a slightly lower ROI than you were before, and that's the ultimate goal. So once you set the hypothesis, you want to test this. Depending on how long it takes for you to generate revenue, your test on this may be 6 months, it may be 12 months. It's going to take time to actually gather the data to understand, although you can start to see trends fairly early, depending on how long your sales cycle is. So here we're seeing our LinkedIn spend, we increased it by 50%, and we do see an uptick in revenue. Our ROI did drop quite a bit at the beginning, and then it kind of came back up and evened out. So our hypothesis here that we would continue to see around a 120 to 1 ROI proved out fairly well if we look at the overall average here. And we're still seeing an uptick significantly higher than if we'd left that budget where it was at as far as the revenue that it's producing. So this is a win. Likewise, if we look at taking the purchase list budget, to me, this is a win regardless of what the ROI is, since there was such a poor ROI on the purchase list component to begin with. But does this prove out that we are hitting that 30 to 1? And initially, it's not. It's a really dramatic shift down. But even a 15 to 1 ROI on this is better than a nothing to 1 ROI. So this is going to be a win. Over time, it may shift back toward where it was before. There may have been other components to think about. Seasonality is often a factor that people don't necessarily think about, but need to factor in with attribution and ROI changing over time. And also the reality that there is causation and correlation. And we always work in between kind of the gray area between correlation and causation as marketing revenue ops people, right? If we're thinking about the perspective of ROI in the primary focus of our business, there are things we can't plan for, right? ROI last year for most businesses looked dramatically different than what they would have anticipated simply because of the pandemic and the shift that occurred with that, right? So these are also things that you have to be mindful of as you're thinking about the data and what it's telling you. So the final component of this is to establish ongoing testing cycles. You need to continue to validate the outcomes of your hypotheses and then create new hypotheses and then repeat that process. You want to consistently be fine-tuning. Even if it's, we're going to bump up our spend by 5% or 2%, that's still a hypothesis to see how far can you push the spend on a particular channel until the ROI shifts in such a way so that it's no longer a good producer or that you hit that kind of threshold of diminishing return. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Q&A.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andy, for this fantastic presentation. So I'm just reading out the questions one by one. Meanwhile,
Okay.
if you guys have any questions about any of the slides of this presentation, then just type in your questions in the Q&A window, and I will just read them one by one.
Great.
All right. So the first question is on the hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing cycle time should be ideally of what duration?
Yes. So typically with your building of a hypothesis, you're looking at the average velocity of at least one sales cycle for that. So that's going to be dependent on your life cycle and how long it takes them to get from discovery to purchase. Some brands, it's a week, and some brands, it's a year.
Got it. Now here is the second question. What type of attribution strategy can suit well for an early stage startup, considering the startup has a limited number of resources?
Sorry, can you repeat it? It cut out right at the very beginning.
Yeah, sure. So the question is, what type of attribution strategy can suit well for an early stage startup, considering the startup has a limited number of resources?
Yeah. So I think that starting with data collection is always the key component. There are tools out there that do layer on top of your CRM data that are as little as like $2,000 to $3,000 a year that allow you to start building models and analyzing. If you are inputting via your website, collecting UTMs and carrying that across onto the campaign, you can use a very simple attribution tool to then marry multiple opportunities against campaign membership and start to get a good feel, at least at a tactic perspective, and for a channel, sub-channel, post-lead creation, what's happening with the dollars that you're spending. So that can be done even with a single one-person team and not a lot of spend on the team side in order to execute that.
Got it. Now, the next question is on how is Hevo helping in marketing attribution? We have both demand-based and visible. So, okay, I'll take this question. So Hevo is not directly, help you with the attribution thing. So Hevo is not an attribution platform per se. It's a data integration platform. So with Hevo, you will be able to connect all your data sources like demand-based, visible, or your marketing team might be using a lot of different ad platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and many others, right? So all of this data you'll be able to integrate using Hevo into a single platform, or maybe in a single repository, which is typically a data warehouse. And from data warehouse, you will be able to connect that data with a reporting or analytics tool of your choice, wherein you will be analyze all of this data together. So this is how Hevo comes into picture. All right. So
I will also say, if I can, on top of that, I think collecting all of the data into one place is often the biggest challenge that most people have relating to attribution. So getting all the different spend vendors into one place, those types of things, so that you can then build it out of a BI tool, which if you're going to do any custom modeling, you're going to need a BI tool for that. Many of the platforms that are attribution vendors or partners don't actually allow for much customization. They have the models that they have. They might have one custom model. If you need more than that, you're going to have to extract the data and then pivot it in a BI instance. So.
Okay, cool. So there is one interesting question. How do you split sales touches? As we know, in a sales cycle, there are both marketing and sales touches involved.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily. It depends on what business I'm working with and how they view that, if they want to just look at it from a purely marketing perspective. But I think that you can create a touch model which has both sales outreach and also marketing inbound and outreach all blended together to understand the overall impact and flow of the business against revenue, and to think about this as revenue reporting rather than necessarily marketing reporting can be a paradigm shift that's very helpful for businesses, I think.
All right. So next question is how to effectively implement the UTM tags for accurate tracking.
Yes. So UTM tags can be implemented in several ways. Typically, what I recommend is a code that you put directly on your website in order to be able to capture UTMs and pull those across multiple page visits until they actually get to a form where you can input those against. You want to make sure that you have a tracking methodology for what UTMs you're using and that you're very consistent about that UTM usage. So you're always calling it PD social for paid social and not sometimes paid social and PD social other times. So a lot of people I know just use a good old-fashioned Google Sheet, and that's what they track. Some have more robust platforms that they've built out for UTM generation. It just really depends on what you have at your disposal within the business. Then those are distributed, obviously, as you're posting your content across the various different channels. When they come to the site, you want to make sure you have that code to capture them and pull them across. A lot of default programs inside of Marketo, for example, the core functionality is just that the form can collect it on hidden fields, but that means that they have to land on the page with the UTMs and fill out the form immediately, and that rarely happens. So implementing some sort of additional code to persist that UTM across multiple pages or even multiple visits can be very, very helpful. Once you have those pulled in, it is the component of pulling it from the person in your marketing automation or database across into CRM, where you can then pivot against the opportunity. So if you're using Salesforce, putting those data values on the campaign member will provide that pivot point.
All right, here is the next one. How often should we test the performance and accuracy of the attribution models?
Ongoing. I would say like a regular schedule at minimum of every 3 months to prove out that things look correct. But this is an ongoing, evolving process. So as ROI changes, as the business changes, as your ideal customer profile changes, you're going to want to constantly be evolving with that. It's not a set and forget, unfortunately.
Yeah. Then the next one is how do you gauge what organic channel would cost as a base mark?
Yeah. So when it comes to organic, I think about soft costs more than hard costs, right? We can quantify what we spend on Google AdWords very quickly because it's a hard number. But when we think about what we spend to employ someone to stand up a website, to maintain that website, when we are hiring someone to update our SEO keywords, those types of things, there is spend there. And so depending on how much the business is spending on an annual basis or initially spent, that typically will give you a good baseline amount to input there. It's not for organic, it's never going to be perfect ROI as far as dollars in, dollars out, because it's not a spend channel, but it's better than putting zero.
All right. Then here is the next one. How to map the entire customer journey, combining web analytics and product analytics.
Yeah. So depending on what product base you're using, there is a lot of information that can be provided out of an interface. And so if you're creating touch points not only on, let's say, website interaction or content interaction, but also post initial, let's say, sign up into your platform and those interactions there, each interaction has an origin point. So if they're coming into the platform because they clicked on an ad again because they Googled you and then clicked on the ad, either because they were being mean to spend more of your money or because they didn't realize that it was an ad and they just clicked, that's still an inflection point between channel and subchannel and the tactic, which at that point would be in platform. And how you're driving people there. A lot of in-platform tends to be via email, but that's also a channel that you want to gauge for performance as well, right? And so that's part of their journey. And definitely, if you have the capability to include that, I would.
Great. All right, here is the next one. As we know, online, attribution or online conversion or tracking is easy. Whereas, how we should attribute the offline spend, or
Yes.
or the kind of traction we are getting from offline channels.
Yes. So you do need to keep track of what you're spending for offline engagement. And often that does involve either putting that on a campaign object on the Salesforce side or maintaining that in a separate sheet or repository for that data. But there's typically a more concrete spend around offline because it is, going to a trade show. It is sponsoring a dinner at an event. It is something where money had to be spent for you to physically be there. And so that spend can be tracked. A lot of attribution platforms have a function around tracking offline spend as well, and that's sort of baked in. But yeah, a tactic is a tactic, a channel is a channel, and you should be measuring each of them basically the same. So input versus output.
Got it. Here is the last one. How to balance scale and ROI.
Okay. So I think the larger your business, the more channels and subchannels you're going to have, right? And as you scale, you should still be able to track that spend. So it really shouldn't matter at the end of the day if you have the baseline data, how large it gets. If you're spending $100 per lead in a channel that is ultimately converting out to have a 10-to-1 ROI, and you go from having 1,000 people come in to having 10,000 people come in, you're still tracking the spend there, you're still tracking the touch point, and you're still tracking the opportunities. So at scale, your attribution model should continue to support however large the business gets without too much adjustment, because it's ultimately the data that's increasing, not necessarily the calculations that need to change, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Andy, for answering all the
My
questions.
pleasure.
All right. So that's about the session. So moving ahead, so we have recently launched a marketing analytic masterclass named as Decode. So it's a 7-course virtual masterclass specially curated by global marketing experts for data-driven marketing and growth analysts. So join us for this masterclass and learn how to harness the real power of your data and analytics to drive your business growth. So it's a free course. You can register on our website www.hevodata.com/decode, and you can watch all the courses for free and download all the presentations there. All right. So with this, I would like to thank all the attendees for joining us today for this session, and special thanks to Andy for this fantastic presentation. If you have any questions or feedback about this session, then please write to me at parag@hevodata.com. See you for our next webinar. Till then, just take care and stay safe.